So hi everyone, and thanks Mo for having me here. Hopefully this isn't a surprise to you, but I'm going to be talking about focus groups today for about 30, hopefully 30 minutes. I am a scholar, so it could be 40, I apologize. This presentation is a kickoff for an online toolkit that will be going up on the 30 by 30 website. I think we just agreed on June 1st is my deadline, so I promise to have it to you up by then. And just as a note, I chopped a lot of the content from the toolkit to fit it down into about 30, 35 minutes. So if you have a question about something that I skipped or that I glazed over too fast, please feel free to type it in the chat or ask in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So the toolkit is designed for agencies that want to do their own in-house focus groups, either for the purposes of 30 by 30 or just to investigate a broad spectrum of questions, problems, or topics that might arise in your organization. The toolkit provides a background and then a how-to guide with example materials, example questions, etc. But it also gives you a sort of pros and cons checklist for deciding whether you want to do this in-house or whether you might want to look outside your agency for a trained academic partner. And I'm not going to go over those pros and cons today, but they will be available to you in the toolkit for making the best decision for what's right for you. Next slide. So my name is Natalie Todak. I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I study topics in U.S. policing with a focus on body-worn cameras, de-escalation tactics, diversity, and women. I specialize in qualitative research methods, which is something that we will be digging into a lot today. And I'm also an NIJ Leads Academic, which is a position given to early career researchers who have demonstrated successful collaborations with agencies. And I saw a few lead scholars in here today. So hi to all of you, and I've missed seeing you at the events. Next slide. So I'm going to begin with a broad discussion of basically what is a focus group, what are the main processes, and what are the main terms that you should know before you begin carrying out your own focus groups in your agency. Next slide. The focus group is a method of data collection in which a small group of people is interviewed at the same time. It's very simple. Everyone sits in a room. The moderator asks a few questions or just kind of broaches a topic, and then the group answers them or discusses them amongst themselves. In social science, this method is used to generate deep, detailed, qualitative data through conversations between the participants. Next slide. The data generated in a focus group include the participants' direct responses to the moderator's questions, and more importantly, the verbal interactions between the participants. Transcripts from the focus group are then read and analyzed for patterns or themes, and those themes that you identify in your data become your findings. A good focus group will involve a lot of conversation among participants, like I mentioned, and not just a Q&A between the moderator and individual participants. So it's not a let's go down the line and each answer the question kind of activity. There are two options you can use to record your data. The first is you can do the standard audio record and transcribe method, or you can take detailed notes or have a partner take notes for you. In either case, having a note taker is always a good idea in case technology fails you, or in my case, when you fail technology and lose your data. So always good to have a backup. Next slide. Focus groups are beneficial because first, they're versatile. What that means is that you can ask any question you want, and the possibilities for what you can use a focus group for are endless. They also save some time and money because you are interviewing a bunch of people all in one shot rather than maybe 10 people individually. And they have the potential to generate richer data than interviews through the interactions between the participants. So someone who is getting interviewed one-on-one may not be able to immediately recall things when someone is asking them questions face to face. But in a focus group, hearing others speak can jog memories or prompt reactions to what the other person is saying. And this may go without saying to most of you, but if your goal is to gather truthful, meaningful data that will help you move forward in your goals, it's vital that participants feel comfortable sharing with you, feel that they are being listened to, and aren't afraid that their input will get shared outside the focus group or get them in trouble. So having the right moderator and having a concrete plan that you can show participants and say, this is how we will be protecting you and your data are very important. And I'm going to go into those, creating kind of a concrete ethics plan on a later slide. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, focus groups are very versatile. If you have a positive experience using focus groups for 30 by 30, you might also think about adopting the approach for other things, particularly where gathering stakeholder input is important or could be helpful. I've listed a few examples here, but I can offer from my own experiences. In 2015, I did a focus group with a specialty unit that was convinced that body-worn cameras would eliminate their ability to work with CIs. But the agency wanted them to wear cameras. So they wanted to gather input from the team so that they could develop a policy that worked for everyone, but still allowed them to work with informants while wearing body-worn cameras. And that particular case is a great example of how successful a focus group can be if the group has really strong opinions or good ideas about something, because I think it lasted over 3 hours and I only asked maybe 2 or 3 questions. So they were very passionate about the issue. They had a lot to say and it was very usable data. Next slide. So why are we asking you to do a focus group? The first thing is there isn't a lot of evidence available that we, when I say we, I mean 30 by 30. We can't really point to evidence and say, here is exactly how you recruit more women. Here's how you retain them. Here's how you promote them. Here's how you do this in ways that will benefit your agency. The body of research is just so small right now, though it is growing. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and obviously many claims are thrown around when it comes to diversity in policing. So in many ways, it's up to you as the first participants to sign on to do something at this scale, to dig in, to ask the questions, and to work to understand the problems in your organization if you want to be successful at this. And the second reason is the limited research that we do have shows that these problems differ agency to agency. To the extent that if you ask 100 women from around the country whether they feel respected in their agency, and I have done this, you will hear 50 say yes and 50 say no. So if you want to know what's going on in your agency, you have to ask the right people in a way that will generate honest, detailed feedback that you can then analyze and use. Next slide. So I recommend police agencies conduct focus groups to investigate the following issues just as a start. Each of these will be in the online toolkit along with some suggested or example questions that you might ask under each header. And of course, if there are other topics that you don't see in the toolkit, but you think of and you want to investigate, you can always reach out to me using my email address and I can help you design the questions or give you feedback on the questions that you come up with. Next slide. So next, I want to quickly clarify a few terms that I may have dropped so far, and all of the terms will be clearly defined in the toolkit. Next slide. First, qualitative research. When I say qualitative, I mean any study that involves non-numerical data. And of course, numerical data would be quantitative research. So any inquiry into something as large and as complex as the one that we're doing in 30 by 30, and what I mean is trying to improve the representation of women in policing, something of that scale will always require a combination of quantitative and qualitative data, with the former allowing you to identify the high-level problems and maybe cause and effect associations. And the latter, the qualitative data, helps you understand the how and the why. So on the right, the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. Confidential research occurs when the researcher knows the identity of the participants, but conceals it from other people, while anonymous research is blinded, where the researcher never knows who participates. So we see anonymous research, for example, with online surveys, where the researcher only receives the de-identified answers in a data set with no names or IP addresses or anything like that. So anonymous research is always preferred to protect the participants, but sometimes it's not possible. For example, with focus groups, like we're talking about today, the research is almost always confidential because the participants and the moderators meet face to face. So it's very important that the researcher has a plan for protecting the identity from anyone else. Next slide, please. Sampling is deciding who you want to include in your study. So you should start with, your broad research questions, the topics that you're looking to answer with your research. And using those directions, you'll be able to identify your population of interest, the people that you're interested in knowing something about. So if you're interested in for example, experiences of women supervisors or leaders in your organization, maybe all women who have been promoted or all women who have been promoted beyond the rank of sergeant and above are in your population that you want to study. So then you want to think about, who do I want to include in my study? So I definitely want to include women supervisors and leaders, but maybe I want to make sure that all ranks are represented in my focus group. Or maybe I want a spectrum of police experience. I want to make sure that I have people who came in, 20 years ago, and I want to make sure that I have some mid-career officers and some newer officers as well. So all of those things are things that you should decide beforehand. And then recruitment is the process of reaching out to those people who fall into your criteria for sampling and asking them if they want to be in your study. So in organizations that receive federal grant money for research, like a university, everything from recruiting on is governed by laws protecting human research subjects. So as a police department, you wouldn't be held accountable to these federal laws, but I do use them to kind of provide you with a backdrop on research ethics to help you to learn how to protect your human subjects that are going to be in your focus groups. Next slide, please. And on that note, let's start talking about ethics. Next slide. So as with most rules and laws that we have, the principles for ethical research with human subjects stemmed from poorly designed or maliciously designed studies that trampled over human rights and autonomy. There are, of course, the mainstream popular examples that everyone learns in their undergrad ethics classes or in mainstream movies. But I think the most informative examples are the everyday studies, the everyday stories of researchers that are not doing their due diligence when they design a study to make sure that the participants are safeguarded from harm. One story that always sticks with me here is the Columbia professor in 2001 who wanted to study how high-class restaurants handled complaints. So without getting pre-approval from his university ethics board, he sent letters to every fancy restaurant in town claiming that he got food poisoning. And what happened was the restaurants went into total life-saving chaos mode to identify the source of the problem, protect their reputations. Employees were torn into, employees were disciplined. Some people have argued that employees were fired, but I wasn't able to find any evidence of that in my research. But a few extra savvy restaurant owners actually detected fraud in the letter upon getting it and reading it. They were pretty suspicious from the beginning, and they reported the professor to the university for what they believed was an attempt to leverage his position to get free meals. But of course, he was doing it as a research study that was just poorly designed and didn't go through a IRB board, which is what we call our research ethics committee at a university. So, and any IRB board worth its salt would have seen the potential harm coming from a mile away and stopped this idea from before it started. So I use this example to show that even if you do have a good research idea that's it's worthy of study, without doing your due diligence and brainstorming and coming up with a protection process for your participants, there may be potential harms embedded in the design that you haven't thought of. Next slide, please. So the three main concerns that you should have when you're designing your focus group study, and I think this is especially important when the subjects are your employees for a variety of reasons. One, there's the potential for coercing them to be a part of the study because they perceive that as a superior, they need to listen, and, the potential for harm to their employment and so forth. All of these things should be at the forefront of your mind when you're designing your study and asking people to participate. The first principle is beneficence, or protecting participants from harm. I remember how to say that word because of Maleficent from Disney. So that's something to help you remember. This is basically the campfire rule. No one should be worse off for having been in your study. You want to leave everyone either the same or better than how you found them. The next principle is respect for persons. This principle affords every participant the right to informed, dynamic consent, where informed means that they get every piece of information they need about the study to make the decision about whether to participate. And dynamic means that they can change their mind at any time. Even if they said yes at the beginning, they can change their mind halfway through or change their mind at the end and still have their data removed from the study. It's a little bit harder with the focus group. Typically, I would tell people, you can walk out at any time during the focus group, but we won't be able to remove your data because it is going to be embedded in everybody else's. And finally, justice means that you aren't forcing some people to bear the burden of participating in research while other people are enjoying the benefits. And this has been a major concern with things like medical trials, where poor individuals are enticed to participate and put themselves at risk through monetary enticement, but only wealthier folks can afford the medical innovations that come out of the research. So all of these things should be, they come into play a lot in some criminal justice research. For example, we can't just use prisoners for research if they're not the focus of our interest, and so on. Next slide, please. So the toolkit will have ample information to help you safeguard against ethical violations. In the interest of time, I won't get too deep into those weeds today. So I'll just say here, one, make sure that you have an ethics plan and share it with your participants. Here's how I'm going to protect you and your data. Here's what's going to happen if, for example, someone accuses someone of something during the focus group. Here's what we're going to have to do with that information. And those are all things that you should decide before you get into your focus groups. Two, don't coerce participation at any stage of the process. I think in policing, it's easy to joke about being voluntold to do things, but if your interest is being a legitimate researcher who follows these principles to the letter, then you're going to want to make sure that it's truly voluntary participation. And that's also beneficial for your data if you want someone to be truly honest and forthcoming with their ideas. All of those things are going to be better off if there's true voluntariness. Three, don't create a paper trail that can tie back to the people who participated. And four, don't break the Vegas rule. What happens in the focus group stays in the focus group. And I think that's also something that should be particularly important for police departments. Everybody knows each other, everybody talks. These are things that we don't want to get out. We don't want to, oh, she was talking about so-and-so in the focus group. All of those things can be incredibly harmful. Next. So finally, let's dig into some how-to. The how-to will make up the majority of the online toolkit. Today, I'm going to be covering mostly the developing a questionnaire phase. But of course, if you have questions about any other process, go ahead and ask that. And potentially we could, down the road do a second webinar on carrying out the focus group or analyzing your data. Next slide, please. So you don't need a lot to do a focus group. I'm going to offer 2 tips here, and I'm sure you can read the rest. One tip I will offer is to pick a room that is away from foot traffic. So every agency is different, but maybe don't do the focus group in the conference room with the clear walls that everybody walks in the front door and sees who's sitting in there. This is something that you don't want to kind of advertise. If your interest is getting people to participate and to be honest, you don't want everybody kind of staring at them and knowing that they were in there. Some participants may not care if they're seen in the focus group, but it really is up to you as a researcher to ensure participation is confidential, whether they care or not. A critical part of the design stage is also picking the right moderator. There's a lot of factors that I would recommend in a good moderator that I'll include in the toolkit. But as a lot of you are police executives and practitioners, if you've ever been in a training, I'm sure you know how important it is to have the right person delivering the information if you want to see results. Next slide, please. So your first big step in your focus group process is to develop your questionnaire. And it can be a very complicated process, but with focus groups in particular, the best strategy is to keep it very simple, because the goal is to, like I said, drop some crumbs, and hopefully they pick up those questions and they take off and they talk about them for a while. So the 3 main stages here are, first, identifying the main topics. So I've added 3 here that you could see. Those are the main topics at the top. Designing questions under each topic, maybe 3 to 5. And then soliciting feedback or pre-testing the questions with some people who will not be in the focus group, but who are in a position to give input. So maybe this could be like a woman sergeant from another agency, or even some officers in your agency that aren't going to be in the study. So here I've gotten you started with some possible major topics, then questions under each that could generate some conversation. And you'll notice that I start with a broad question to begin with, and then I narrow it down to more specific. And that's for a number of reasons. One, it's to avoid leading. So you can kind of get the idea that they have on the broad question and see where they go with it first. And then you can ask what your main question is and see what they have to say about that one afterwards. Next slide. And I've only got 2 more for you, so I promise I'm getting close here. I'm sure most of you have heard the term leading or biased questions. There are a lot of opportunities in a focus group to lead the participants and taint the data or skew it in a way that's favorable or desirable. Often, how I've seen this happen is this is unintentional, and it's when the moderator is not well trained or not aware that they're doing it. So to avoid leading, the moderator should first stick to the questions fairly closely. The trick is to follow the script, but also kind of maintain a natural conversation style that's generating discussion and prompting participants to explain. So maybe ask, do you have any other thoughts about that? Is there anything else you can think of? Rather than, but what about X? A lot of people say that. Why aren't you saying that? Or, but don't you think X, Y, Z? All of those things are kind of, infusing your opinion or what you think they should be saying, rather than just kind of seeing what they respond to based on the questions that you wrote down in your planning phase. And I mentioned in the last slide, begin broad, see what you get with that more open-ended question, because sometimes that can be the most interesting, and then move to a more direct question. And of course, if your participants are saying, no, I don't think that, women are treated any differently than men, take that no for an answer. Definitely ask why, and then move on. You don't want to be arguing with them because that's the easiest way to skew the results. Next slide. Okay, so a few last minute tips. First, don't bite off more than you can chew. I say this because I often get requests, often from high school or college students, to do an interview with them for a project, and they'll send me a list of 100 interview questions that they want to go over in an interview in 30 minutes. If it's a good interview or a good focus group, responses to each question should consume a good chunk of the time. You want back and forth. This isn't a survey where you ask a question and they select an answer. It's a conversation. People who are newer with focus groups often find themselves an hour in and they haven't gotten through 90% of their questions because they made a list that's way too long. So select a few things to cover, maybe have a few backups just in case it goes a little faster than you planned. But just the goal is to cover something in depth, not to cover a large amount of material. Next, don't settle for one-word answers. Unless they say, and I don't have anything else to say about that, so don't ask me again. Use prompts, ask them for examples. The goal is to get them talking to each other a lot, not just to get an answer, check, and move on. I see a lot of newer researchers ask a question, like a lot of my students, and they get a one-word answer, and then they're uncomfortable and they quickly move on to the next question. And then they end up doing all of these interviews and they don't have any good data. So this is supposed to be a conversation, and I'm sure that's the major theme that I've said 20 times already. So respond, ask more, ask for examples. Have you ever seen this in the field? How did that play out? It can even be helpful to remind them, it's okay to explain. It's okay to keep talking. I'm looking for more data. So don't feel self-conscious if you think you're talking too much, because more is better. I always use that with one-on-one interviews. More is better. Please keep talking. I love it. And of course, I always am studying women officers and they want to say, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. I'm like, that's exactly what I'm hoping you'll do. So please give me as much as you can. And that usually does help to put people at ease. And finally, always send them off with what am I missing? What else should I be asking? Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, but I didn't cover in my questionnaire? You might find out that they had a lot to say, but you didn't ask the right questions. And often I find that the real answers are there at the end, and you finish the interview and then they're like, well, what I really wanted to say was, and then there's 2 paragraphs of good data. So always send them off with, what did I miss? It almost never fails. That's what I have for you today. Thanks, Christina. You can switch that. Thank you. Please feel free to ask questions. I did see some qualitative scholars like Nikki in the Zoom today, so please feel free to jump in if anyone has any thoughts or feedback. And definitely check out the toolkit once it's live, because it'll be way more detailed and have a lot more tangible things that you can use than this brief presentation. So thanks, everyone.